Okay, so since we have been clearly talking enough about photosynthesis and how climate change impacts photosynthesis, so today's class and Friday's class is going to be a bit more looking outside of the cell and more like how it matters, how basically climate change impacts, how all of the things we have been talking about might be affected or are going to be affected by climate change. So specific things that are important for today's discussion.
It affects their ability to produce defensive chemicals that would like target insecticides, and then also affects their growth hormones.
So it affects hormones that are going to affect their growth, their ability to, fight certain insects or pathogens. What else are they doing? Yes.
It affects pollination.
How?
Because when the temperature rises, because pollen is sensitive to heat, there's not as much pollination, which means plants don't reproduce as much.
So, sorry, what did you say about pollination? Because what?
Pollen is sensitive to heat.
Okay.
So when the temperature rises, there's less pollination, which means there's less plant reproduction.
Yeah, so one of the things is pollen is susceptible, somewhat to heat, sometimes somewhat to UV exposure. And also pollination, I think is, at least in terms of the reading, what that is important is talking a lot about the timing. You need to have a timing between the plant producing pollen and the pollinators being there, right? If pollen is dispersed by wind, then the plant is going to be fine. But there are certain things that the plant will not be able to do efficiently at higher temperatures. Yes.
They have reduced levels of, I believe it was SA and J, which are the chemicals they use to get rid of pests and have stronger mechanisms against them. So once those are reduced, they're more susceptible to predation.
Yeah, so it is going to both temperature and CO2 are predicted to alter the kind of normal regulation of plant defense hormones. We're going to start talking about hormones in detail next week, but some of the most important hormones are jasmonic acid, salicylic acid, and ethylene. And so they are in different ways expected to be altered by higher CO2 and higher temperatures. Anybody else can think about something else that will alter plants? Yes.
I know one of the things it said is that it affects the flowering cycle of like C3 plants.
Do you know why?
I'm trying to think. I'm not sure why. I think it was messing with the hormones in it, is what I think I understood.
Okay, so I'm trying to think why flowering of C3 plants.
Oh, because with the way it does photosynthesis and stuff like that.
Yeah, so one of the things is higher CO2 is expected to affect beneficially in terms of what Rubisco messing up, more C3 plants than C4 plants, because C4 plants already figured out how to deal with lower levels of CO2. So in brief, looking at a small window, C3 plants will benefit. If you could isolate CO2 alone, just that, they would do a bit better because Rubisco would mess up less for them. Anyone else can think of something that is going to alter plants in response to CO2? Yes.
It decreases nitrogen and then it also
Sorry, it decreases.
nitrogen,
Okay.
and that affects like the nutritional like benefits of the leaves of plants, which like
Yeah. So how does it decrease nitrogen?
because of the temperature affects the nitrogen.
So is it that it decreases nitrogen, or is it more duration?
The ratio,
Yes. So which ratio?
the CO2 and nitrogen.
The carbon nitrogen ratio, right? Plants always have, so the carbon is coming from the atmosphere, the nitrogen is coming from the soil. If there's a lot of CO2 and there's a lot of light and the plant can fix a lot of CO2, then now the nitrogen is the limiting condition. How much nitrogen can you pull from the soil? Okay, and so that's plants, right? And so the reading was mostly about how climate change, speaking as a higher CO2, and how that leads to warmer temperatures, affects plant interactions with other organisms, specifically with insects. So you're going to be answering a couple of questions in your groups, and then everybody hopefully will have the chance to answer the remaining questions.
I have a question about it said that it increases carbohydrate levels, but it decreases nutrition, or like carbohydrates
It
in the ground.
increases the carbon nitrogen. There's more carbon and nitrogen production. So insects eat it. They get the carbon, but not so much nitrogen because we need both, right?
Yeah,
Then you have to eat much more.
with more like a nitrogen level.
Yeah, so it's as if you were eating, like, I'm not saying that comparing to calories, but you know, when you eat food with low nutritional value,
Yeah. Okay,
kind of have to eat more to compensate.
That was the first question.
Yeah,
And
but it's okay. Okay.
I know when I did this question with the eyes, I was like,
Large emotions per year. Small.
Wait a second. I don't really know.
Of insects?
yeah, for the generations.
Because when it's warmer, you know,
Yeah.
insects are regulated by temperature. I
Who's
mean,
this?
like plants. So if it gets warmer, let's assume all insects are regulated. So if it gets warmer for April 10th, but instead if April is a month before, then insects are going to start being released. And they might complete not just one life cycle, but maybe actually go through rounds.
Oh,
Because they emerge
Long
later
term, they're gonna
and it's warm for longer periods of time. So instead of a single life cycle or two life cycles, they can actually complete an additional one.
okay.
And so now you have more life cycles. And also if winter is shorter and warmer, because many insects hibernate in some other way, well, more than hibernate, it's it's overwintering. If it's, many of them die. But if the winter is shorter and warmer, it's more likely that the ones from this year, instead of half of them dying, almost everybody makes it till the next year and things like that. So over time, you increase the number of new cycles
Okay, that makes sense.
Good.
I don't know about short term.
I think some of it actually. I don't think CO2 really affects fertilizer much.
Okay, so I know that it decreases.
No, the amount of carbon in nitrogen is gonna be higher carbon. To compensate,
one of
because
these
because as if you were eating a lot of
What is it?
that doesn't have a lot of nutritional value, so the carbon is important for them, and we also need to get our nitrogen from somewhere. So if you're lacking that.
Yeah, so I would just ask you about it.
Also
So
eat.
like they need the
Get-
nitrogen. Like the nitrogen is very important. They have more carbon in the nitrogen.
Yeah, because
So the
CO2
nitrogen
itself
is less
doesn't
dense
affect
than the other
the insects, but CO2 itself doesn't seem to affect them directly.
Yeah,
Or
I'm just gonna. It's just the ratio. Same amount.
Long term, you just, if there's more insects, they're gonna be having more plants. So long term, it's making. Well, long term, in the reading, it talks about like long term life plants. Like, because if you're, long life plants, if you're living longer, the more bugs are to escape. Like, because you're not producing as many, and you're taking, if you're growing, if it takes you 10 years to grow from it, those bugs are gonna murder you basically, like,
I was thinking more.
Oh,
CO2 actually affects the herbivores.
I don't know what, like, it's probably both. But
it's kind of the same. Short term, they eat a lot, and the long term, they have more time to grow and like
Which I think generally speaking and was, but
I don't know, I didn't really see anything like specific.
actually makes sense.
Yeah, because I was like sitting there and I was.
Looking at that certain herbivores normally wouldn't be able to use it. So
We ever produce what?
I wouldn't say it's like,
Oh, you want salicylic acid?
yeah, I wouldn't say it was the
Jazz.
yeah. Was
Yeah, it showed that adaptation was in response. Yeah, which is, I do remember talking about like changing what plants are down there. It's like, I feel we're answering this question backwards. It's like, how is CO2 affecting plants and how is that affecting herbivores? And so what I'm looking for is more on like the how does CO2 affect herbivores. Not.
so there's elevated atmospheric CO2 affects plant insects. Interaction with different plant metabolism and elevated temperatures will affect plant insect development. It said that insects respond to elevated CO2 during airborne position. When foliage
Keep you over here. That's what
What I said earlier about the carbon nitrogen ratio is not correct. It actually is that there are decreases in leaf nitrogen. So whether or not that actually leads to like stopping growth, like those kind of symptoms, or if it's just like the naturally low
No, I
growth.
think you're right. Like, it's not that they're not uptaking nitrogen, but it's just
They don't need as much. Is the
I think it's-
distinction.
well, no, they would need more nitrogen, right? To keep up with that, because like so, when I'm thinking about in terms of like to build a leaf, right? You need proteins.
Mhm.
Proteins require nitrogen.
Yeah.
So you can have a crap ton of carbons and a buildup of carbohydrates. But so like this down here is, which is correct based on my use of an increase of carbohydrates by 23%, but reduce protein levels by 10%. So you don't have the nitrogen build proteins. So you
Yeah.
basically just got plant with a crap ton of carbohydrates, but no proteins.
So how I'm reading this section here is that simultaneous effects of temperature and CO2 amplify decreases in leaf nitrogen, which is what raises the carbon nitrogen ratio. So then reduction of leaf nitrogen by a combination of suggested elements.
Which I think isn't that what leads to their leaf being easier to kill and whatnot, because they don't have as much protein. Yeah, I remember reading something about a deep oil into that. And I was thinking about it, I was like, I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? You like you have all these proteins that are meant to help regulate things in the leaves, and if you're short on proteins, a lot of those cells are going to be more susceptible to like say environmental sunlight.
Yeah.
Their repair mechanisms are going to be bad, so it might have to kill the
Not
leaf.
as much plasticity.
Yeah. Because I don't think we need answers on it, but I'm 90% sure that we don't need the protein to reduce like the cell rates. I remember seeing something about powders that it's like pros and cons.
Slightly different. We make more sensitive.
Yeah, so it's really less about these elements. I think it's the plant outcome chemicals. And there's some different perspectives where it's these changes the diversity of defensive chemicals are produced by plants in a differential response to generalists and specialist herbivores. These chemicals show simple predictions and cause and effect. So it's how elevated CO2 temperatures modulate hormones which like plant defense. And I think that's because, if I remember correctly, the increased CO2, I don't know if it's when it's paired with temperature, but one of those, when you increase it, the plant produces more of these oleochemicals, which makes it stronger defense against pests. But by doing that, you're also making pest resistant insects.
Mm-hmm. It's just like the arms race.
So animals or herbivores will have to eat more plants to gain the nutrients they need from the nitrogen. Because like in the leaves there's less heat and that would increase just plants overall.
But it's like how does like CO2
So the thing before we did
The CO2, the higher, if you increase the CO2, the nitrogen.
It does say it decreases for high temperatures.
This is macros and
But Because so for elevated temperatures that increase the also decreases the nitrogen.
Okay.
This is kind of interesting. So these volatile compounds, VOVCs, are made by plants, including ossifying, monobeans, green leaf volatiles, methyl tisoliate, others, acids of the plant's defects, pollination, communication, and the emission of VOC announces that a plant is under attack, and then male awaits further answering call. Elevated CO2 may directly suppress the effect on carotenoid synthesis, but production of larger plants by elevated CO2 and the direct stimulation by elevated temperature likely increases
Interesting. It's a really fascinating fact. Crazy how this episode is like so natural. It's just like, yeah, it's wild.
We'll work on these 6 more minutes until 10:40.
Oh.
Then 10:40, so we have 25 minutes.
Is there any questions on the back of this? No, shoot.
I've been so interested in this one. I still haven't found much directly about CO2 and aerosols, but
We can always at least come back to looking at that if we have extra time.
as arms race. So,
How it goes back and forth. Yes.
or insect herbivory essentially promotes the production of CDOCs and yellow chemicals.
Yes. Definitely for the events. So salicylic acid is more organic pathogens like fungi, bacteria. Jasmonic acid is more organic. So ethylene is also kind of goes hand in hand with jasmonic acid. So SA in one hand, JA and ethylene. And one of the things that plants have is
Can we use an
there's
example
lots
for
of
this one?
mechanisms by which most of the time if you
This question.
turn on JA
An example how the mechanism leads to plant
and if you
insect
turn on
adaptations.
SA, JA. So that's why, for example, when a plant is being chewed on by insects, and it induces JA, it might fight against the insect, but then you become more susceptible to pathogens, and vice versa. Because there's cross-talk between them, and I was telling them there are some bacterial pathogens that figure that out. And what they do is their toxins, instead of killing the plant, they create toxins that looks just like jasmonic acid. And so when the plant sees a lot of jasmonic acid, it thinks it produces them in terms of SA. And because this is a bacteria, it's like a return of SA here. So they make the plant, their toxins are actually hormones. Yes. How did they learn? I have learned.
You brought that part of the gyuhjik acid and salicylic acid.
I think that's all. At least one of them. If you have a nice things. I don't know.
I mean, I know that as it sounds like. I think so, the other.
Home set out all the CO2 and
Wait, what?
so CO2 is suppressed by jasmine acid while stimulating the production of
It's the most important hormones in plant defense responses.
Be those jasmine acid.
Are those hormones?
Yeah.
I know, that's all that I need.
Salicylic acid. So, can you run down on their effects?
So jasmonic acid
Yeah, that's right. It's like a regulator, it looks like. So it says, describe how they confer points the ability to fight pathogens and herbivores.
hormones, so stimulate immune responses by immune responses and spikes.
I don't know if it's just
Okay, so let's start wrapping up that worksheet, and so we're going to start discussing the answers. So how are insects in general affected by high temperature and high CO2? So let's start by high temperature. Okay, let me see. I think okay, Nick.
So in warmer temperatures, insects reproduce earlier and more often, and then they're also more readily available to like survive in the winter with high temperatures. They're like more increased in temperature.
Why do you think they reproduce more at higher temperature? Can you think of why insects reproduce more?
Is it because they just have like higher metabolic rates with higher temperature?
Yeah, well, they probably have higher metabolic rates, and it's also kind of many of the cues. So insects are, emerging so they are overwintering. So if you think that now the world is becoming warmer, not in March, but in February, right? The cues or the warmer weather might hit them earlier, and they might start emerging earlier. If you start emerging earlier, and also it stays warmer before the winter starts again, there might be enough time to run 1-2 generations and maybe an additional generation. So they might have more time to undergo an additional generation. Also, as you mentioned, if winters are warmer, the overwintering period might make more of them survive. So this year you have an additional generation, and on top of that, winter is not so cold, so that most of the overwintering ones survive until the next year. You have more insects to start with. Now they are undergoing more generations. So over time, you're going to be increasing the number of insects. Yeah. What about CO2?
So the CO2 is going to affect the carbon and nitrogen ratio, which that will affect the nutrients in the leaves of the plants. So that will affect the insects when they're eating the plants because they won't be gaining as much nutrients. They'll have to eat more. But not getting all those nutrients will affect the development of the insects completely overall.
Yeah, so the higher CO2, directly the insects won't be affected directly by it. But basically, as you said, their effect is based on what we know that will happen to the plants. So there's more CO2, the plants are going to have more carbon to nitrogen ratio. So the leaves, when insects eat it, are going to have more carbon but not enough nitrogen, and that's going to cause them to eat more to compensate for the lack of nitrogen that's provided.
Plants will be hurt, like plants are going to be consumed more by the insects, and there's going to be less plants and less food growth and less reproduction, and ultimately plants will be gone. And then
Yeah, I mean, if you have more insects, right? And we're talking specifically herbivores, then that's not going to be good news for plants. So what we have is, at higher temperatures, we have in terms of the insects, the herbivores, higher developmental rates, higher reproductive potential, overwintering survival, and the number of generations per season that's known as volatilism might increase. And so what does it mean? Severe defoliation. And one of the examples that the reading tells us is there was a year in which the Norway spruce was severely defoliated because basically, particularly warmer temperatures, the spinning of life, it was abundant of these herbivores. And, conifers do not really regenerate their foliage as efficiently, so severely damaged. Do you know why farmers rotate corn and soybeans? Yes.
I do.
Is it because
Replenish the soil.
one of them uses a lot of energy or something like that, and then fixes it in the off season?
Mm-hmm.
So which one would fix nitrogen?
Is it the soy?
Yeah, so soybeans are legumes, right? And legumes interact with rhizobium to fix nitrogen. So that's why the largest ecosystem across this country is the soybean corn rotation. So farmers don't care so much about the soybean as much as they care about the corn. But corn consumes a lot of nitrogen, and breeders are breeding for varieties that the ears are larger. Larger ears means a lot of just nutrients stored there, which means they need more carbon but also more nitrogen. So they are getting a lot of nitrogen from the soil. So by alternating that with soybeans, it eases us in terms of replenishing the soil with nitrogen instead of you fertilizing millions of, I don't even know how large the corn bells and all of the corn.
Oh, it's a lot.
But that's the main That's the main part, is provide nitrogen to the soil. And so, that's one of the examples that the book has. And it is basically when you have soybeans, also one of the things, if you think about it, crop rotation is always important, because if you have a pathogen that colonizes the soil and is present there and can infect corn, and then the next season, instead of giving it corn, you give it soybeans. Pathogens are specific for plants as like us. We tend to think of plants, they all look the same, but a soybean and a corn can be as similar as us and a dog. So a pathogen that infects a dog is not necessarily going to infect you. So now you give it corn and the pathogen is like, well, I'm going to die, I have no hosts. So crop rotation is also important for fighting off pests. So in this case, when farmers grow beans, there are two main herbivores that attack soybeans. There are beetles and aphids. So they don't worry so much about the beetles, because when the beetles emerge, most of the soybeans are in these, so these are different developmental stages of soybeans. So B1 to B3 are vegetative stages, and these R1 to R8 are reproductive stages. So when they emerge, they are in the B part, and soybean is resistant to that particular beetle when it's in the B reproductive stage. So even if it's there, it doesn't cause a lot of damage. And then when they start weighing down, then it's like, well, we are in the R stages, but the loss isn't terrible. They are more worried about the aphids, because when the aphids emerge, the plants are already in the reproductive stages. When, if you're reproducing, you're already trying to start growing more foliage and filling out those seeds that are going to cause you to basically reproduce. So damages during the reproductive stages are more severe, and in terms of farmers, that's more damaging to them. So the timing when they rise is important for farmers to know when to spray and how to control these things in terms of their fields. We already saw what warmer temperatures do to that. But can you tell me what the timing? If you think this will affect interactions with the Japanese beetles and the soybean? Yes.
The higher temperatures cause the soybean plants to produce less of there's like this PI hormone, which causes them to produce the actual natural insecticide defense compounds, which means that the beetles are able to eat more of it, which can rest.
Yes, okay, so but this would be just specific for them, it would be for any herbivore, right? How temperatures affect these specific interactions?
The beetles are able to eat less of the plant, but the aphid is able to eat more of the plant, right, which causes the seed to go down.
So which one did you say will eat less?
Isn't it the beetle?
Why will it eat less?
Isn't it because of the... Sorry.
Take your time to think about it. So why do you think the insect, let's start with the beetle. What are warmer temperatures doing to the reproductive cycle of these beetles? If it is warmer, what's going to happen with the timing?
They're producing earlier, so they have more life cycles for reproductive.
Yes, and if they are reproduced earlier, how do you think that is going to affect the plant? If they are released here in the bee season, if they produce earlier, is that going to affect the plant?
The plant is smaller and not as mature, and it starts getting eaten so soon, and it can't grow as much, which means that they have less plant to eat.
But soybeans are resistant during the bee stage.
Then they're eating more.
They're eating less. So the thing is that this is what happens. If you have these beetles coming on earlier, the plant is resistant all this time. If you, instead of starting here, you start here, plant doesn't really care what it is. It's resistant. If the beetles are released earlier, and the plant can almost complete the season, right? Or at least the beetles complete a season, right? While the plant is still in the B stage. The plant can still be resistant to that beetle. And in terms of the aphids, it's similar story, right? The aphids are basically being released when the plant starts being susceptible, but if it's released earlier and the plant is resistant, then that first emerging pattern might be fine. I mean, so my assumption is this is like one of the examples in which they are saying, well, if we're talking about pests and just limiting it to these pests, the fact that they are being released earlier doesn't necessarily mean it's going to harm all of the plants. Now, we're not counting additional generations, and we're limiting this to territory. We're not assuming that plants need insects to be pollinated. And if the plants flower and the insects, the pollinators aren't there, then pollinators won't be, flowers won't get pollinated and insects. Yeah.
I remember seeing something in here about like they may not be able to attack soybeans, so they'll actually go to a different food source if possible, because there's other plants that would be susceptible during that period. So I mean, I'm assuming that would be another major effect, right? Because then you'd have another plant that normally would be okay during this.
Yes.
They'd have an alternative food source now taking the full force of it.
And that's very important as well. So some insects are gonna be generalists and some are gonna be specialists. So generalists, as the word says, I'm not gonna say any plant, but they can, if this is not available, I can just move and eat a different plant, right? If for some reason, they are going to emerge and this is not available, they might just go and infect. So while soybeans might be fine, you don't know what's happening next door. And also, so those are generalists, which can basically adapt relatively easy. If you have specialists, like many pollinators are, they don't just go pollinating everything. Then those interactions might suffer more if you have no alternative sources of food for the insects. Yeah.
So because of the carbon nitration ratio being lower, the plant chemistry has less nutritional value. So in order to meet the insect's needs, they eat more in order to meet its needs, and it also kind of affects the insects because they're not getting as much nutrition. So more of them are actually dying as well.
Yes, and so that's also an important thing. So insects, right? We said, well, the timing is important for pollinators. Also because the carbon nitrogen ratio is affected, as we mentioned a couple of times. The insects are expected, to eat more, but also some insects can have lower weights once they are fully grown. So yes, there might be more generations, but it doesn't necessarily mean directly. So as you can see, it's not one single answer to all of these. And because all we know are because of those, phase experiments that we didn't get to discuss, but that they were designing in the previous class, in which plants are exposed to high CO2 and see what might happen. That's kind of the thing for me. One of the things is an example that is actually what Justin was mentioning is that the common butterfly initially, these common hops was their main source of food, and then when these started disappearing or the timing wasn't right, they could easily or relatively easily go and eat or feed from other sources, but this is not the case for all plants. So in general, at higher CO2 plants, it can induce flowering, can make it basically faster, can increase the carbon content in leaves and also in nectar. If you remember, there's a part when it says that you might increase the amount of sugars that are present in the nectar. And while some insects, some pollinators like more sugars, some of them might not like it and might not use it. It affects the carbon nitrogen ratio. Currently, higher temperatures will also do that. And so high carbon foliage is going to be detrimental to the insects, and so more defoliation. So let's be a bit more specific. Okay, so they're going to eat more. Okay, so how is this going to affect the plant? Well, the plant is going to have less leaves, yes, but what happens? Yes.
So the plant will have to produce more like defensive chemicals in order to try and resist like the overeating of pests.
Yes.
And then like that, it's like the cycle will be the plants produce more of those chemicals, and then insects will be like evolving to try and become like immune to those chemicals, and then that's like the arms race concept.
And so what happens with the allocation? So if you're allocating more resources to these chemicals, what do you think is going to happen to the plant?
I would imagine you have like a little bit more like stunted growth if you're not like using your nutrients for growing.
Yeah, so basically what you have is plants are being defoliated. They have to, well, yes, of course, replace foliage. Not all plants can do that. So if you can replace your foliage, you're going to be allocating resources to that. If you cannot, and you're just trying to defend yourself, you're going to allocate many resources. And because we care so much about crops, I'm not saying forests are not, but let's say ones that produce the money and people are worried about that. If a plant is allocating the resources into fighting, into defending, then it's not going to allocate resources in the products. That is what we want them to do. So that, it's basically a cycle that we can only predict what happens, but it's a lot of basically allocation of resources. And also, as we're going to see, and you probably saw from the reading, when a plant fights against something, that resource allocation also makes it susceptible to something else. So that's also a problem. So part of it, let's assume that the defoliation is considerable. You have a lot of insects over 2 or 3 years. And you're talking about, let's say, one of these forests, and conifers do not really replace their foliage. So you have severe defoliation, and severe defoliation leads to, let's say, deforestation. So a lot of these forests just start dying. This was not in the reading, but have you ever wondered why people say that if we kill the Amazon forest, we're going to have CO2 emissions? Yes.
Because there aren't more trees taking up the carbon. So it just goes up and gets trapped in the atmosphere instead of getting absorbed by all the trees in the Amazon.
Yeah, so that is one part. You have less trees doing photosynthesis there at the end. But plants themselves also put a lot of carbon out by respiration, right? So that might be one of the problems. But what is the main problem when you think deforestation, and why CO2 concentration increases in the atmosphere when you have deforestation?
So those trees are huge carbon sinks, that they're storing all the carbon in the plant, and then when the plant dies and decays, it's just like releasing all that carbon back out in the atmosphere.
Yeah, so it's a combination of both things. The one we tend to think the most, and I think it's the one that, it's the easiest one to see, or not the easiest, but the most obvious one to see is there's less plants, you have more CO2 in the atmosphere because nobody is fixing that CO2. But the main problem is forests are carbon sinks. So all of that carbon is all part of the carbon cycle. Those big forests, that especially the old ones, they have clearly a lot of carbon and nitrogen and many other things stored there for decades, for hundreds of years. They start dying, all that organic matter is going to be released in the soil. But it's not like fossil fuels that is stable, put there underground, and we have to basically dig to get it. This is carbon that once it's in the soil is entering the carbon cycle. It's going to go into the atmosphere, and there's more CO2 just by the plants dying themselves. So a lot of that CO2 or that carbon more is going to be released into the atmosphere by deforestation.
Sam had talked about it earlier, but as the amount of insects increase, there's going to be more attacks on plants. And as there's more attacks on plants, they're going to evolve to defend themselves against insects. And in turn, the insects will try to defend themselves or try to evolve to maneuver around the defense mechanisms of the plants.
Yeah. So how would you define arms race?
Kind of like as the defenses of the plant increase, the defenses of the insects are also trying to increase, like get better over time.
Yeah, so whenever we talk about evolutionary biology, that's basically what we have in arms race. You do something, I fight back, I fight back, I fight back, and then in turn you have something. So let's assume this is a plant cell. And so plants have a basal defense mechanism, just like we do. We don't get sick. We can fend off most things, and only those things that manage to fight back are the ones that are pathogenic. So plants have a mechanism, and we will explore more of this in detail, in which they know what molecules are in pathogens, more general pathogens, like chitin, for example. Chitin is abundant in fungal cell wall, and plants don't inhabit. So if they see chitin, they know they have to fight. They are like flagellin. So flagellin is present in flagellin bacteria. If they see that, I shouldn't have that, let's fight back. So they learn, they know, they know how to recognize basic structures that are present in the saliva of some herbivores, just basic mechanisms. And so what happens is when the plant recognizes them by receptors, they release, initiate something that's called pathogen triggering, and that's like basal immunity. I'm just going to fight off the basic mechanisms. You don't have to do anything, just by having something that looks pathogenic, I'm going to fight off. So, that's what you have. Then what happens is, if the plant can actually, if the plant can basically defend itself, what is it going to do? It's going to do what's known as basal defense response. It's going to release reactive oxygen species, and you know what that does, that it's basically destabilizes many molecules, so that's going to fight off the pathogens, antimicrobial compounds, and secondary metabolites. Some of them are explained there. And so now the plant is resistant. I recognize you, I fight off, but then specialized pathogens, they don't stop there. They're like, okay, so I'm going to secrete some molecules that are known as effectors, and we'll talk about them later on, that will suppress those initial defense responses. So now you have a susceptible plant again. So now you would recognize, I fought off, and I'm fighting back. And then after a while, the plant is like, okay, I learned how to recognize your effectors, and so basically I am fighting back, and now you have it. And so this is basically the arms race that happens in all of these, evolutionary, co-evolutionary arms race between plants and pathogens. So we will, that's the end of today's class. Just the next class, we have 2 readings, assignments from the New York Times. It's about the flooding in Pakistan. And so we're going to be talking about that. They are not just theory articles, they are like lighter readings. But we will start with the question about the hormones. And then from there, we will talk about the assigned readings. Please make sure you leave your worksheet.